So, Adam and Eve. Adam is a man, Eve is a woman, obviously. They were the progenitors of all mankind. And this is known as Cepheus and Cassiopeia, which are two circumpolar constellations. Adam, Cepheus, Eve, Cassiopeia, and they're right next to what? A big damn serpent in the sky.
I'm falling down a dark hole. Then I see...
Jesus was taken up by the serpent to a high place, where he could see all the kingdoms of the world. The serpent, the old serpent, the devil.
A rabbit in a waist.
That's Draco.
A smiling cat.
I didn't know cats could smile.
Neither did I.
Draco took him to the high point in the sky, so he can literally see all the kingdoms of the world. And what's up there? The progenitors of all mankind. And Adam, Eve, a Cepheus, and a Cassiopeia, and a big damn serpent.
I'm afraid so. Old man, bonkers, off your head. But I'll tell you a secret. All the best.
Down a dark hole. Then I see strange creatures.
What kind of creatures?
Well, there's a dodo bird, a rabbit in a waistcoat, a smiling cat.
I didn't know cats could smile.
Neither did I.
Top of the morning to you. I hope you're all fine and dandy and staying ahead of the game. Remember, it is a game, and each one of us must play a part. Welcome. So, I put this video out, I think it was yesterday, but it was unfinished, and this is probably one of the most important recordings of late recently that I put out, because it's dealing with sin and the propagators of sin. And as we know, Eve normally is the one who gets the blame, but what I want to look at today in this recording is, first of all, I want to highlight some standing stones, quite a number of standing stones that are in Scotland, and we're going to look at the Cassiopeia, Andromeda story, and how it's written on stone, carved in stone. And we have the mirror, we have the comb, we have the serpent, and various other things which we see in the heavens. And in order to fully grasp and understand where the conception of sin, or a sin wave, a fall into this material realm came from, we need to understand or understand exactly how our ancestors seen it. And thankfully for many people in Europe and many people who come to visit Scotland, they can see this narrative, this story carved on the standing stones. And what I'm going to put in now is just a whole selection of standing stones, which has actually been running during this this talk. You can see all the different standing stones showing a mirror, a reflection, a serpent, and so forth. And we're going to look at why women get the blame for the fall of man. Was it really the woman? Was it really Eve or Cassiopeia in the heavens and her daughter Andromeda? Was it really the female of the species who are responsible for the world and the way that we're living now? And of course it wasn't, and this is what I hope to show in this recording. So we've almost likely read the poem by Rudyard Kipling. Put my teeth in. So we've almost likely read the story, the poem by Rudyard Kipling. Or if not, we can all hum the tune, "The female of the species is more deadly than the male," performed of course by the band Space in the 90s. They are two completely different forms of storytelling. One's a poem and the other's a song, but the message is more or less the same. Rudyard Kipling's rendition was written in the early 1900s, released in 1911, and was intended to be read with a certain chuckle and amusement. But analytically, there was an important message about the survival within the different species we see up on the earth. Rudyard Kipling admires the various species of creatures and humans and compares their flight or fight instincts, while the other, a more modern rendition written by a 90s UK pop band, seems to be focusing on the horrors of women, their familiarity with evil, the evil inclination, deception, death, the Jekyll and Hyde, and the Dracula and Frankenstein mentality, stating as fact, basically, that women, or the women, are somehow cunning and dangerous, the sort who deal in witchcraft and deception. The female of the species is more deadly than the male, by Space, was written in the 1990s by Tommy Scott, which is often heard sung badly at drunken gatherings and pubs and so on. The two muses, in their use of the term, the female of the species, seem to sum up pretty much how the woman has been portrayed throughout history, be it in the animal kingdom or in the realm of the physical living being. As it is with many prominent artists, poets, movie directors and the likes, they are often addressing controversial social and political issues of the time. It's a concept and belief which has humorously made its way into our recent pop culture. And almost 100 years after Rudyard Kipling wrote his poem, it really is no surprise to hear such a modern description of the woman being the only one to blame. Because that's really what the song's saying. The woman is deception and deceit and evil. It even portrays in the song those lyrics that she's a witch in some sort of way, evil and not to be trusted. We have all grown up with this belief. It's been forced upon us that Eve, the female of the species, was the culprit, and still is the one to blame for the fall of mankind. But what is the truth behind the story of Eve's deception and the subsequent fall of mankind? Was the woman always the one to blame? Or have we somehow drifted or been coerced into that way of thinking by those who rule over the ancient astrological narratives? If we go back in time to the earliest manuscripts and writings, what does the story of Eve and the serpent have to tell us? And what can we glean from these ancient manuscripts, the manuscripts that are out there, to restore the balance between man and his counterpart, the female of the species? Now, in antiquity, the serpent was always seen with a woman's head. And this is like late antiquity and in the Middle Ages. One of the oldest and most striking visual traditions shows the serpent with the face or the upper body of a woman, often closely resembling Eve herself. The key examples of this are the Romanesque manuscripts from 11th century to the 12th century, where the serpent is frequently depicted as a snake with a female head. She has long hair. Well, the snake has long hair, similar to Eve. Sometimes even Eve's facial features are within the serpent's face. An example of this is Hortus Delicarum, 1180. The word Hortus Delicarum is Latin for the Garden of Delights. It was a medieval pictorial encyclopedia compiled by the nun Herod of Landsberg at the Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace. Now, I apologise if I'm saying these names wrong. It is better known today as Mont Saint Odile. The serpent has a woman's head that strongly resembles Eve in these early manuscripts, visually implying identification or reflection. Now that's very important. It's identification with reflection. And the images that we're looking at here on the page, we see Cassiopeia being marked on standing stones in the northeast, and we see this reflection, this mirror and this comb, this sort of vanity and looking within and desiring a reflective pose, and a psychological and physical understanding that Eve was not so much tricked by the serpent, but that she was reflecting, or the serpent was a reflection of her inner desires, which of course relates to the inner kundalini energies, or the serpent energies, which we must rule over. So in these Hortus Delicarum, which is Latin for the Garden of Delights, this medieval encyclopedia, it shows the woman's head, the serpent, as the serpent, visually implying identification, or as I said, a reflection, an inner reflection. The interpretations to most medieval viewers would read this as temptation arising from likeness, Eve seeing herself reflected in the serpent, moral weakness mirrored back at her from the serpent. And this sort of manuscripts, this sort of artwork in early antiquity, the early Roman period, this is not accidental symbolism. It was intentional theology rendered visually for us to take in and absorb. But as we go on, we'll see that this image fell out of favour, this reflecting image and the image of Eve being a reflection, or the snake being a reflection of Eve, the inner workings of her mind. In these ancient manuscripts, we have symmetrical compositions where Eve and the serpent are basically visual doubles of each other. In many medieval manuscripts and illuminations, even Eve and the serpent are placed on opposite sides of the tree. Their bodies are curved in parallel S shapes. The serpent's head is positioned at Eve's eye level, mirroring her posture. Now, an interesting thing here, I'll just mention, I have mentioned in other posts, but Cassiopeia in the heavens, the asterism we understand, or we know as Cassiopeia, is shaped like a W. I don't think it's any coincidence that today in modern Hebrew, or what we understand as the Hebrewic language, the letter shin and sin, two letters that represent the letter S. See in this, it's telling us here the bodies are curved in a parallel S-shaped. I don't think it's by chance that Cassiopeia in the heavens is shaped like a W, and today's sin and shin, two letters for the S in the Hebrew, are actually this W shape. But that's for another post. Many examples can be found in medieval manuscripts and media. Cathedrals and capitals in France and Spain, Anglo-Saxon and Ottoman manuscripts show this reflective quality. Even the early Byzantine marginal illustrations show this. This creates a type of mirror effect. Eve reaches, the serpent reaches. Eve inclines, the serpent inclines. The tree becomes the axis of reflection, or what we call the axis mundi. Many people have asked about what the axis mundi is, and so, our ancestors seen the axis mundi, this reflection of the serpent and Eve, reflecting each other as the axis mundi. In early Jewish and early Christian cultures and practices, the visual idea is not so purely as it was in the medieval age. Within the rabbinic traditions, some of the early Jewish texts describes the serpent as upright, speaking, intellectually similar to the human. This made visual blending possible. What we have today, this visual blending of the two in a sort of misunderstanding of things, it's allowed this blending where Eve is now the one to blame, and it's not merely a reflection, but she is the sole cause of man's sin, which is wrong, of course. The early Christian theology of the church fathers like Augustine, Tertullian and Ambrose associated Eve's temptation with self-recognition, pride and imitation. Not merely deception, as we've been taught that the serpent tricked Eve and mankind, but rather reflection. Artists in the early days translated this into their visual reflection, with many medieval churches and artworks showing this. By the time we get to the Renaissance, there's a more subtle change in how we perceive Adam and Eve and the serpent. By the Renaissance, the imagery becomes less explicit, but it's still present, of course. Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel shows the serpent has a female torso, not a head, but a female torso. So things are starting to slip away. The original, how we depicted it, an important word, pictured it, has slipped away, and it's Eve and the serpent have become two separate beings as such. The literal same face disappears from the likes of Michelangelo's work, but the compositional mirroring, this imaging of reflection, reflecting on her inner desires, is still seen, but it doesn't remain as obvious as it was in the earlier manuscripts. So what is meant by this symbology? What is we seen symbolically? Historically, the imagery suggests temptation is internal, and it's not external, but it's an internal desire. Eve is seeing her own desires reflected in the tree and into the serpent energies. And this makes sense when you understand Kundalini, the Kundalini serpents, and how to reign over those energies. It was moral failure on Eve's part. As self-alignment, she aligned herself with the deception. It does not mean artists in any way thought that Eve was the serpent, rather that temptation in all its forms works through recognition and likeness, not brute force. And this is very important. In later times, Eve and the serpent become less reflective on their appearance. And it gets interesting because the disappearance of Eve and the serpent mirroring is not just an artistic change that we see historically, but it's also a theological and cultural shift. And when did this happen? Well, we'll go on and look at that. During the Western tradition, what we've seen in the Western tradition, which is sort of Latin Christianity, late antiquity, and Romanesque and Gothic, what we see between the 9th and the 12th century in manuscripts such as Hortus Delicarum, 1175 to 1185 from Alsace, we see the serpent has a female head. The serpent has hair, facial features, and a gaze that is a reflection, an absolute mirror of Eve. Eve and the serpent's face are one of the same across from each other in the tree. The key point in this is the visual doubling that we see. The serpent is not merely tempting Eve, as we've been told. It looks like her. The serpent is clearly depicting her inner reflection, and we see this same imagery on the standing stones throughout the northeast of Scotland, immediately below the North Celestial Pole. So the idea of the biblical narrative happening in the Middle or Near East is absolute deception. It never happened there. Cassiopeia, Cephas, Andromeda, which circle or circumpolar, which are circumpolar stars of the North Pole, and it's not in the Far East, but these images of Adam and Eve are actually from the Northern Hemisphere, that which we see circling Polaris. In Vienna, Genesis, the 6th century Byzantine influenced sort of belief system, Eve's posture closely echoes the serpent's curves. The tree itself acts as a vertical axis. As I said earlier on, it's symmetrical. It's the axis mundi. Though earlier and more restrained, it already hints at reflection rather than an full-on confrontation with the serpent. And this is very important because we have been led to believe that Eve was the one to blame and had a physical confrontation and engagement with this serpent. But this is certainly not how we envisaged things in previous generations. When we look back at the ancient manuscripts and reliefs, we can see that the imagery regarding the serpent and Eve has changed. And so Eve, the female of the species, is the one to blame in our minds. It's been made that way so that we blame each other and it causes division between us. In the Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, the Junus manuscripts of the 10th century, the serpent itself, Draco, coils in parallel to Eve's stance. Its gaze is in alignment and emphasises her identification with the serpent in the tree. In Romanesque sculptures of the 11th and the 12th century, the cathedrals and the capitals of France and Spain, which I mentioned earlier, you can see this same reflection in the Autumn Cathedral, in the Velazé Abbey and the Mosaic Commune of southern France. And all the artworks in these places show Eve and the serpent intertwined and a reflection of each other. The common feature is a serpent with a woman's head. Eve reaches towards a fruit as the serpent mirrors her very gesture. Bodies curve in matching S shapes, and what I said earlier on is the letter S, shin, and sin. In Hebrew, the letter S is the shin, sin, which is of course a W shape, exactly the same shape as we see the asterism Cassiopeia up in the heavens. The capitals which we see in a lot of these churches, these pillars and stuff with the carvings, they're meant to be read typologically. It's a compressed theology in a form and a picture, an image. The mirroring would have been immediately understandable and legible to the medieval viewers. They knew that Eve was not in confrontation, but rather was reflecting on the inner desires. And we've kind of lost that now. And so the female of the species has taken the brunt of the blame. The meaning in the Western medieval context, or Western theology, tended to emphasise the interior temptation, the moral weakness, and the pride and a need to imitate. Visual doubling was communicated in all their artworks. The serpent speaks because Eve already listens within herself. This aligns with the Augustine sort of theology. Augustine, he thought, or he believed, that temptation succeeds because it resonates with the inner existing desire. And this is very important because there is a lot of misinformation out there which people resonate with, but just because you resonate with it, it does not mean that it is truth nor fact. And this is what the standing stones in the northeast of Scotland are actually showing. They're showing this fall from the heavens, this inward desire, rather than a physical deception by the serpent. This aligns completely with what Augustine taught. The early Eastern tradition, Byzantine and Orthodox Christianity, here the contrast is very striking. In the Byzantine manuscripts and mosaics, examples such as the, probably not saying this right, Chuladov Psalter and the Paris Psalter and Ravenna mosaics, the Chuladov is spelt Chludov, Chludov, from the 9th century. In these manuscripts, the characteristics which are shown is the serpent has become fully animal. There are no female face, there are no reflections. So there's clearly, by the 9th century, the beginning of a change in how we perceived the fall, and this interaction between Draco and Cassiopeia, the serpent, and Eve. There's a clear switch, a clear change. But why? Well, Eastern theology emphasised more than anything else, it was a cosmic deception. So in the Byzantine manuscripts, they understood that it was a cosmic deception. Satan himself, according to the Byzantine manuscripts, is an external fallen intelligence. He came from the heavens. Yeah, there is less focus on the psychological interaction, and by the time we get to the 9th century in the Byzantine Empire, what we're actually seeing is the temptation of Eve is an assault on her sovereignty, but not a reflection. And no, we can begin to see that as our ancestors pictured it on the stones, we have kind of moved away from that original thought process. Sorry about that, I had an important phone call to take there, but let's continue and let's get to the root of why Eve has been portrayed as the one who brought evil into the world. I just say here before I start that I probably haven't said, it hasn't come clear, but what we're actually seeing with Eve is emotions. So in the early days in antiquity, and this is what we see in the heavens, it's not so much the woman is to blame, it's the emotions, it's that emotional side of the brain which is projecting. And not just projecting, because we are creators, it is creating a scenario which, of course, those who control and manipulate us have used and changed the original manuscripts and how we've seen things in order to, as I've said before, cause division between the man and the woman. And in doing so, not only have we battled each other for generations and blamed each other, but what has happened is man it has persisted in his mind that the woman is to blame and that the woman is somehow evil. And this is a horrible thing, because personally for me, and I know it's the same for a lot of people, many people have grown up in an abusive home where the father was either alcoholic or just an abusive man towards his partner. I personally witnessed a system back in the 70s and 80s that turned aside. The police and the authorities allowed a man to domestically rule over the woman to the point of almost death, with beatings and so on, because it was acceptable that man was the head and the woman was the tail. And that tail is that she was to blame for the original sin, which is not true at all. But what we are seeing, what I'm trying to show here, is from the early days in the manuscripts, in the early days in the iconography, in the early days, it was obvious that woman, and the image of the woman, was not an accusation or a blame of the woman, but that Cassiopeia was an inner reflection of the human, the living being's desire. And we'll continue on. What we were looking at is the Eastern iconographic designs which we see within Orthodoxy and within Eastern Orthodoxy. And what we have seen by the 9th and the 10th century is Eastern Orthodoxy, especially, once a form had been established, so they separated the serpent and Eve from an internal reaction to an attack by the serpent, and of course Eve, morally and physically for generations, have, because of the manipulation of manuscripts and how we perceive things now, Eve has taken the blame, which, as I said, during the 70s and 80s, the authorities and the police would turn a blind eye to violence, to physical violence in the home. And many of us grew up as children, and into adults, carried that belief in some sort of way that man has a superiority over the female of the species, which is not the case at all, and it certainly is not the story which we see reflected in the heavens and also within our own physical anatomy. And the stars up there, every single star, every asterism is pointing to the physical anatomy and how the anatomy works as a reflection which we project onto others and into our own lives. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, by the 9th and the 10th century, once they had this form established, the separation between Eve, no longer reflective, but Eve being the one who was tempted, then that sort of form, that iconography, that imagery persisted. And any type of innovation or any type of adaptation to what the Eastern Orthodox believed became I don't know what's the word I'm looking for. It was a heresy. Yeah, it was a heresy. So you could not say, by the 9th, 10th and 11th century, you could not say that Eve was not the issue. Eve had squarely taken the issue in the jaw, and she was now the one to blame. Which, of course, I have to repeat and repeat, this is not the case. It set us all against each other. And instead of looking at how the Kundalini serpent energies and the material desires can encapsulate us, instead of seeing that, we are now blaming a soul or single serpent, a devil with horns, which clearly didn't exist. It was all pointing to Draco, the great serpent in the heavens. So, in Eastern iconography, there's no serpent. There's no doubling of Eve as the tradition develops. There is no woman headed with the serpent head. It becomes part of the Eastern Orthodox canon that Eve is the one to blame. So the two traditions, Eastern Orthodox and Western, they see the serpent as, in Western tradition, as a hybrid woman, a woman-headed, and in the Eastern tradition it began as fully animal. Eve herself is psychologically implicated in the Western tradition, and in the Eastern tradition she simply becomes morally tempted by the serpent. Temptation itself, as we see it in the Western tradition, was an internal resonance. It was a reflection of internal desires, whereas in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, and the churches within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it's completely external. So there's a separation of the two, when really there should not have been a separation, because it's a cosmic event. Cassiopeia, Cephas and Draco and all this happening, Andromeda happening in the heavens with the mirror and the reflection, and now we have something completely different. Whereas, as said over and over again, the woman gets the blame, which is wrong. How and why the imagery changed, this is something that we need to address. We have to, why, who changed it, who was behind changing it, and to where we are now, where the woman is getting the blame. Well, the theological shift moved, I suppose, from an allegory to literalism, to actually, the literal event taking place. In the late medieval and the early modern period, there's increasing anxiety about heterodox imagery, which is not conforming. Heterodox means not conforming to the religious beliefs or whatever of that time. So there's this increasing anxiety against non-conforming to what the church teach. The woman-headed serpent begins to look theologically dangerous, as if she's the one taking the fruit and causing the sin and the death of man, or mankind. This could imply even that Eve herself has been replaced and she is Satan, which is completely wrong. It also could imply that temptation is innately part of the feminine nature, which of course we know is not true. Temptation can come to us all, and this is what the story of Cassiopeia, reflecting on the mirror and looking back on the Kundalini dragon, the Draco, the great serpent, this is what it's actually originally showing us, and this is what our ancestors marked on standing stones throughout the United Kingdom and parts of Europe. And the great thing is that these stones are still there, so we can look at these stones and see the shift. The stones are 3,000 to 5,000 years old. So we have the physical carved stones in the northeast of Scotland and in Ireland and in North England and in various other places scattered throughout the UK. And I have put maps up on my page showing where the asterisms are reflected 3 times in the heavens. But that's not for this post, that's for another post. By the time the scholars and those who were in charge of the text and had the authority of what we call the canon, the Bible, what we get is a clear distinction. By the 9th to the 12th century, a clear distinction between that reflective quality, and Eve is blamed there. During the Renaissance, what happened during the Renaissance art, they introduced, in a way they introduced anatomical realism. They focused on classical proportions, and in the Renaissance they focused on the animal nature, the natural animalistic instinct. A serpent with a woman's head now looked mythological. It looked grotesque, I suppose, by the time we get to the Renaissance period. If you imagine the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo and all these beautiful pictures there, to have a grotesque beast woman, as it was pictured a way back in the early manuscripts, it was grotesque, it was unacceptable. It was also, by the time the Renaissance came along, we were into science and the advancement of what we call modern science, and and so it just was unscientific. It was not acceptable to depict this reflective nature of the serpent and Eve, which, as I must point out, it's not Eve. What it is emotions, because the feminine is the emotional. And this is what our ancestors are showing on the Starry Stone. So the artists, by the time of the Renaissance, in this sort of naturalistic way that they were presenting things, by the time we come into the Renaissance, what you're seeing is Eve and the serpent are no longer look alike. They're completely different. But it still echoes each other's posture. The serpent and Eve in the tree still echo, and that's what we see in the Michelangelo painting in the Sistine Chapel. A complete change where the body is the serpent and the head is Eve. They are no longer one and the same inward emotion or reflection. By the time of the Reformation times, of course, the Reformation times is the 1600s, so what we're dealing with during the Reformation is an angst, an anger against icons and idols and stuff like that. And symbolism, as it had been shown within the Catholic and Orthodox tradition, when we come into the Protestant Reformation times, it's unacceptable. They throw all this out. So we lose this iconography or this imagery that were in the ancient manuscripts. And the sort of Reformation and the Protestant movement completely rejected anything that was non-scriptural. So anything that was not in the scriptures, that could not be seen or read in the scriptures, was simply thrown out. And, you know, the Reformation was the 16th century, so we have 400 or 500 years of that idea, the ancient manuscripts, of the unity of both, of the reflection being cast aside. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, which began in the 16th century, tightened any sort of icons or idols control. They prevented imagery, which was seen as heresy, basically. And within the Reformation movement, we had so many people enforcing a clarity on, you know, what was Eve's sin, and the woman's serpent hybrids just completely vanished. And another thing to mention is gender politics, because we're living with gender politics very much so just now, and as the sort of Christian and Byzantine and Eastern and Western theologies hardened, they more explicitly began to blame Eve, but not identified with Satan. The serpent had to remain clearly the other half, the other, you know, the one who caused the problem. Ironically, this protected Eve visually, while it condemned her morally. And this is what we're living with now. Women are condemned, subconsciously, condemned by society, because of this false teaching, this completely false teaching that just came in and slipped in. What does remain after the disappearance, even after the literal imagery disappears, there are some traces which do remain. For example, the Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, we've seen this, the female has a torso, a serpent torso. There's a transitional form happening, halfway erased, halfway remembered. And, you know, so Cranach the Elder, he depicted Eve and the serpents as sharing eye lines and gestures, psychological mirroring without physical resemblance. What we begin to see is the ghost of an earlier tradition, where Eve is morally the female of the species, and the soul, the one who is to blame for the fall. Now, why does this matter in this day and age? Well, of course it matters, because we have moved significantly from what was seen in the heavens to what we see in our churches and what we hear taught in our churches now. The disappearance marks a loss of symbolic psychology in the art, a move towards moral literalism, and a narrowing, a complete control over visual theology. Earlier artists were willing to say evil persuades by resemblance, but later artwork and the thought behind the later church fathers and those who control the church organisations were evil. They seen it as evil was external, identifiable and separate, not merely a reflection. The question which needs to be considered, of course, is how does other religions, we've been talking about Christian, but what about Islam? Are there any Islamic parallels that we can draw from? And yes, of course there are, because the Islamic parallels, though they work very differently from medieval Western and visual tradition, they still hold the key in what they teach. Islamic tradition, for example, does not develop a stable, figurative, iconographic picture of Adam, Hawa, or Eve, and Iblis, comparable to the Christian art, but it does preserve structural and symbolic parallels that overlap with the Eve serpent reflection idea. And what I mean by that is, in the Quran, Iblis, the devil Iblis, does not deceive by disguise. He tempts by appealing to self-knowledge. And it's not Eve's self-knowledge, it's the living being's internal self-knowledge. He speaks enough truths in Islam, in the Quran. Iblis speaks the truth, but yet it's twisted enough just to resonate with the living being. And we see that just because something contains truth doesn't mean it's true. You know, the evil in this world imitates the truth, of course. The key verses within the Quran are as such: shall I guide you to the tree of eternity and a kingdom that does not decay? Now this is Iblis speaking to Hawa, Eve. So what we're seeing is not so much brute deception. Again, it's going back to the ancient manuscripts, or how it was seen in the heavens. A mirrored desire. Now bear in mind that much of what we understand about astronomy and astrology and asterisms in the heavens, a lot of these were Arabic Muslim clerics who studied astronomy. So they obviously seen this in the heavens, and this continued within Islam. A sort of mirroring effect, a mirroring of desire, showing us what inside within the human really desires. So although there is no visual doubling as such, because in Islam they don't have a devil or a serpent as the deceiver, but rather Iblis is a jinn or some sort of demon, which I'll get to later on. So although there is no visual doubling within Islam, the psychological mechanism is very close to that of the Western and the ancient medieval manuscripts, which we see. Temptation itself succeeds because it is a reflection of our own selfish or inner desires reflecting back on ourselves. And it's not Eve that's getting the blame. It's the same for man and woman. This emotion is not the nature of Eve, but it's the nature of man and woman. And we understood that, and that can be seen when you study the standing stones, as I have in Scotland. You can see that it's a reflection, a mirror, and a comb. And the comb represents the drum of heaven. It's the comb, the broom or the sweep of Polaris as it sweeps around the North Celestial Pole. And so we have the comb in the mirror, and of course up there sweeping round the North Celestial Pole we have Draco pursuing Ursa Minor, or the pole star, and the sun and the moon to devour them. So the serpent's absence in theological meaning, unlike Genesis, the Quran itself never actually names a serpent, because we're looking at Islam here as their comparisons there. The tempter, who is known as Iblis, is a direct being. He's a physical being. Why this matters is Islam avoids projecting evil into nature. Of course, nature is not evil. It can't be. Evil is a conscious moral intelligence. Evil is a conscious, Evil is a conscious moral intelligence, something that we choose to do, and animals don't have that. And this is shown in Islam. Nature itself, according to Islam, remains morally neutral, and you can see that. That's obvious. So this blocks any development of the ancient way that animal-human hybrids were seen, which represents the heaven. The visual mirroring between Hawa, Eve, and a creature, is just the same. But the function of temptation, appealing through likeness, that remains. This remains. It's a function of temptation by seeing something that is a reflection within ourselves. So in Islam, Hawa, or Eve, is not singled out. The crucial difference from Western Christianity, Adam and Hawa, Adam and Eve, are tempted together. And that's how it's portrayed in Islam. No exclusive blame is placed on the woman in Islam. No feminized symbol of deception is seen in Islam. This removes the gender logic that made Eve, the Eve serpent, visual reflection so potent in medieval Europe. In Islamic theology, temptation itself reflects human weakness, not feminine nature. And this is what I'm trying to show. The mirror of Cassiopeia is a reflection of our own weaknesses, and not necessarily the feminine nature. We can't blame the female. Islamic visual culture, where parallels appear indirectly significant. During the Persian and the Ottoman manuscripts, around about the 14th to the 17th centuries, some illustrated manuscripts, excuse me for saying this, I don't speak Arabic, the Qissa al-Anbiya, which is the story of the prophets, do depict Adam and Hawa, Iblis nearby, and the tree centrally placed. But Iblis, as I said earlier on, is usually some sort of angelic being, a jinn-like being, not an animal. There is no physical resemblance to Hawa, to Eve, and the separation, not mirroring. Iblis often aligns his posture or gaze with the humans. Visual rhetoric suggests intellectual proximity, not bodily likeness. This is the closest Islamic analogue to the mirroring idea that we have. The Sufi interpretation, the Islam, the Sufi thinkers seen things a bit different. For example, Al-Ghazi ibn Arabi describes temptation as the ego itself speaking in one's own voice. And that's very good. The self misrecognizing itself. And that's exactly what we are seeing on the standing stones of the northeast of Scotland and throughout the UK. We're seeing this misrecognizing. Eve, mankind, doesn't recognize their own nature and instead desires something out with. This is conceptually very close to the Western and medieval visual claim. So what we're actually seeing is Islam retains, in a way, some of this reflective properties. And Eve is not to blame, but Eve and the story of Hawa is simply a reflection of what her inner internal desires are. Why Islam never developed Eve serpent imagery is pretty obvious. Iconic work of animals, people, it's not known within Islam. You very rarely see living beings, creatures on any artwork, especially religious artwork within Islam. The other thing is there is no serpent in the Quran. There's no serpent in the Quranic text. There's no gendered theology or blame in Islam. Evil itself is defined as a moral choice, not symbolic in nature. So the idea survives and the images don't in Islam. In Western Christianity, Eve and the serpent are mirroring each other. And I mentioned earlier on the Hortus Delicarium, which is the Garden of Delight, and Herod of Landsberg, 1175 to 1185. The Illustrated Encyclopedia, that manuscript, which is from Hohenberg Abbey in Alsace, it was destroyed in 1870, so that we have copies which have survived into the 19th century, which show the temptation of Eve, but we do not have the original. So conveniently, a lot of the ancient manuscripts and artwork have been displaced, destroyed, or removed, and in its place we have this blame of Eve, brought in by the Western and Eastern Church Fathers, basically. So what we need to look for is the serpent with the female head and long hair, a face and hair which visually echoes Eve, and a tree as the vertical axis between them. As I said earlier on, it's the axis mundi, it's the shift. Now, some of you, I haven't put all the images in because I just haven't got time to go through and save and look for all the images, but what I'm going to do here is give a sort of a rundown of where to find these images, and you'll find reproductions in the Rosalie Green Hortus Declarum and the Warburg Institute, which have been there since 1979. You also have the Strasbourg Municipal Library and digital facsimiles, which is all copies of these ancient manuscripts. If you're going to search anything, I would suggest you search for Hortus, Hortus, Delicarium, Deliciarum. Type in Hortus Delicarium, Eve, serpent, woman, head, and you'll get images showing how it was seen in ancient times. This manuscript, the Hortus Delicarium, is the single most cited example of Eve and the serpent being visually doubles or reflections of each other. In the Vienna Genesis, which I mentioned earlier on, the 6th century, which is late antiquity and just going into the early Byzantine era, what we see is in the library of Österreich National Bibliothek, under the shelf mark of COD Vindebonius Theo GR31. These are records which hold these manuscripts. If you look at for the shelf mark COD Cod Vindobonius Theo GR31 and type in Illuminated Genesis manuscript into any sort of search provider, type in Illuminated Genesis manuscript, and these will come up. And what we're looking for in these images is the serpent changing, being fully animal, but Eve's posture mirrors the serpent's curve. Strong compositional symmetric images. So this is the early root and later the Western mirroring tradition. In the Janus manuscripts, which I also mentioned earlier on, it's known as the Cadamon manuscript, which is 10th century. It's Anglo-Saxon. You'll find in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, shelf marked under MS Junius 11. And if you'll see the scene, if you type in Genesis Temptation, Junius manuscript, Cadamon manuscript, you'll see here parallels and gestures of Eve and the serpent, visual echoes without the hybrid anatomy. In Western and Romanesque sculptures on stone, the Autun, Autun Cathedral in Burgundy in France, 1120 to 1135, the artist Giselbertus and his workshop. The location is in the nave capitals. What you'll see there is the serpent with the woman's head, even the serpent bending towards each other, matching this S-shaped bodies, which I mentioned earlier on. S is the letter sin or sin, shin, which is shaped like a W. And there you'll see one of the clearest sculptural parallels to the manuscripts. In the mosaic Abbey Cloister, which is the early 12th century, the location is the Tarn et Garonne in France. You'll see a medium, which is a marble. The artwork is a marble capital, a pillar, and what you're going to see on there is even the serpent himself share gestures and inclinations. The tree itself in the mosaic Abbey Cloister, the tree divides the composition symmetrically. So you have this symmetrical reflection going on in the early 12th century. The Velazé Abbey of the 12th century, which is in Burgundy in France, what you see there is a woman-headed serpent. Emphasis on visual dialogue rather than a physical attack upon the woman. In Eastern Byzantine, in the Kludov, I mentioned before, the Kludov Psalter, which is mid-9th century, what you see in the library at the State Historical Museum of Moscow, shelf marked as MSD 129, what you see there is a fully animal serpent. So we're looking at the cosmic, heavenly creature, and it's a fully animal serpent. There is a clear separation in the Kludov Psalter from Eve and the serpent, and there is no mirroring or any sort of mirroring going on. This shows what never develops in Eastern tradition. And the Islamic manuscripts, although they're conceptual parallels, the Qissa al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, from the 14th to the 16th century, which are Persian works, you'll find key copies in Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, in the British Library or MS Collections, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And what you'll see there is, within Islamic artwork, you see Adam and Hawa, Eve, together. Iblis also is present as an angelic form, or a jinn just standing close by, a figure, but there is no serpent. Temptation shown through proximity and speech is the key here, and if you search Qissa al-Anbiya Adam Hawa Iblis illustration, you'll get records of images and access to images of the ancient manuscripts there. So the Nama, or the Book of Omens, which is an Islamic Persian book of the 16th century, what you see there again back in the Topkapi Palace Museum, which is in Istanbul, what you see there is a didactic symbolic composition. So it's self-taught, self-learning, and moral testing without any sort of bodily mirroring. So we're really moving away from the original, what was seen in the heavens as a reflective, inner reflective, to a separation and an expulsion or complete removal of Draco the serpent within Islam. And we have this transitional depiction going on, as I mentioned earlier, Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, where you see the temptation and the expulsion, which was works done by Michelangelo 1508 to 1512, and as I said earlier, the serpent is the female has a female torso, and the last major survival, I suppose, of this hybrid tradition we see in the Sistine Chapel. After this sort of period, round about the 1600s, after this, essentially that imagery of the two intertwined as reflection disappears. So, if you want to look at these pictures, I've gave a list of the museums and shelf marks and showing the temptation of Eve. And these are available in the British Library, the BNF Galatia, the Bodleian Digital Collections, and the Topkapi Palace manuscripts of Istanbul. So even the serpent and temptation, a comparative visual theology. So the purpose of this is this one-page sort of comparison outlines how Western Christian and Islamic traditions conceptualized and visualized temptation in Adam and Eve's narrative, focusing on presence or absence of mirroring between Eve, Hawa, and the tempter. In Western Christian tradition, in the Latin West, the core visual logic is temptation by resemblance. By the period of the late antiquity, the Romanesque, in the 6th to the 12th century, things began to be removed. Illuminated manuscripts and cathedral sculptures still have some imagery, but it began to change. The serpent is, by the 6th and the 12th century, the serpent is frequently depicted as a hybrid snake body with a woman, or a composition aligned with Eve, matching her exact posture, gaze and gesture. Even the serpent often mirror one another across the tree, and the tree itself, as I've mentioned before, acts as the visual axis, or the axis mundi of reflection. And I've mentioned before, Hortus Delicarum, the woman-headed serpent resembling Eve, the Atone Cathedral of 1120, Eve and the serpent with parallel S-shaped bodies, and the mosaic and Vézelay capitals, or pillars, mirroring the gesture and inclination of the serpent and Eve. So the theological meaning of all this is temptation itself is not exterior alone, but also interior. And this is what happens. It's internal and exterior. And what this brings in is evil persuades by likeness, but not by brute force. The serpent reflects Eve's own desires back to her. And so the visual thesis is the tempter looks like you, acts like you, because temptation is the work of recognition working through you. So Eastern Christian tradition, Byzantine Orthodox, the core visual logic is temptation by assault. Remember, the Eastern Orthodox looked at the heavens. So by the 6th century, we had this sort of stable iconography going on. It never really changed. The serpent is always fully animal. There's a clear separation between Eve and the tempter. And yeah, that's what we see. In the Vienna Genesis, there's a partial mirroring, but there's no hybrid. And in the Kludov Psalter, there's 9th century, there really is a strict separation between the two figures. And the theological meaning, I suppose, is evil is a cosmic, not cosmetic. Evil is a cosmic external intelligence. Less emphasis on the psychological self-recognition and more on the heavenly. Islamic tradition, its core concepts is temptation by persuasion, not likeness. As I said, there are no serpent in the Quran. The tempter Iblis is a jinn, a fallen being. Adam and Hawa, or Eve, are tempted both together, and no bodily or gender mirroring is ever given in Islam, because they don't use physical form of humans in most of their religious artwork. So why the Western mirroring disappears, because we need to look at that. It was brought in deliberately by, the church fathers in Rome, I suppose. And then, of course, when you have the Renaissance, they threw everything out, so we lose everything. So the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation take control of iconography and pictures and images and throw it all out. And gender theology and blame hardens. And Eve takes more of the blame. The result of this is the physical mirroring vanishes, psychological mirroring survives subtly, for example in the Michelangelo artwork, but really everything is being removed. So the comparative summary that we see is the serpent in the Western Christian is a hybrid mirror. In Eastern, the serpent is fully animal. In Islamic, the serpent doesn't exist. Eve or Hawa is the psychological implication in Western tradition, whereas in the Eastern tradition is she's morally tempted by the serpent, or by her own desires, really. In the Islamic tradition, both are responsible, both are co-responsible for what we call the fall. Temptation, according to Western tradition, is an internal resonance, whereas in Eastern Christian tradition, it's an external deception. And in Islamic, what we see is not so much a deception, but a subtle persuasion. And the visual strategy within Western Christianity is a reflection of symmetrical symmetrical reflections in the tree. But in Eastern Christian tradition, there's a complete separation, and complete separation. It becomes a cosmic battle alone, and not an internal reflection and symmetrical of the heavens and the earth and our internal thoughts and actions. Whereas in Islamic tradition, what we get is it happens through proximity, or being near to Iblis, the tree, and speech interaction between the two. So the conclusion, because I need to bring this, we're at 40 odd minutes now, and I still get another 20 minutes to join to this, so that's over an hour. But what we're actually seeing, and thank you for sticking with me, and I hope that this makes a lot of sense to you. I'm basically trying to show that what we had in the heavens and what we understood and knew to be from the heavens was slowly pushed out through time. So early Western art uniquely visualized temptation as self-recognition, collapsing the boundaries between Eve and the serpent, whereas Eastern Christian and Islamic traditions rejected this visual psychology completely. And of course we've lost the understanding and the true meaning of what the heavens were showing us, and what the biblical accounts were teaching us. And the disappearance of the mirroring of the image marks a broader sort of cultural shift away from the symbolic interiority towards a more defined doctrinal clarity, which of course gave rise to the modern belief that the female of the species was more deadly than the male, and to blame, and therefore she is the one who takes all the rap. But what I'm trying to do here is show that it's in the heavens, and Cassiopeia and Andromeda do not represent the female in any way, but rather the thought processes of, fight and flight, emotion and logic, right brain and left brain. And we've been deceived not only by where this event is said to have occurred, because it did not occur in the Middle East, but we've been deceived completely, and the entire narrative, the entire story has been removed from the heavenly realm and placed elsewhere, creating a people and a nation which is not the biblical Israel at all, but the original biblical what is real is in the heavens over the North Celestial Pole, reflected down the spine of Albion, the living being who represents man and woman, and thus projected to the ends of the earth. I hope this helps, I hope this makes sense, and yes, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry if it's a bit all over the place. I've got so much notes in it, and it's such a vast subject. There's a lot to undo historically and mentally and psychologically in our own heads. Like I said, most of us have been brought up with the idea that a woman should be silent, a woman is to blame, a woman is the evil one, a woman is less or something less than a man, which is not the case at all, either in the biblical narrative or in the narrative which we read in the heavens. Each one of us are responsible, as it says in the book of Ezekiel. Each one of us are held accountable and responsible for our own actions, and nobody else can be held responsible for sin waves or chasing a material, physical world of falsehood. And really that's what we've been made to do by losing what we knew to be the knowledge written in the heavens. Genesis 1, I say this all the time, Genesis 1:16 tells us that we must observe the signs and the seasons by looking at the signs in the heavens. And I'm just trying to show everyone that we have forgot not to look at everything out there that has been changed through history, not to look at writings and works that are modern or recent, but actually look to the heavens and look to the standing stones, which is what my interest is, and read for yourself the true story and the true nature of the fall of mankind and the human frailty that we all have, male and female, because the female of the species is certainly not more dangerous or lethal than the male. Thank you.
Insurmountable odds greatly. The female of the species is more deadly than the male. Oh, shock, shock, horror, horror, shock, shock, horror. I'll shop myself hoarse for your supernatural force. The female of the species is more deadly than the male. Oh, she deals in witchcraft and one kiss and I'm zapped. Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me? Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me? Frankenstein and Dracula have nothing on you. Jekyll and Hyde join the back of the queue. The female of the species is more deadly than the male. She wants to conquer the world completely, but first she'll conquer me discreetly. The female of the species is more deadly than the male. She deals in witchcraft and one kiss and I'm zapped. Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me? Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me? She deals in witchcraft and one kiss and I'm zapped. Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me? Oh, how can heaven hold a place for me when a girl like you has cast a spell on me?